This is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the note left by Gabby Petito's killer, Brian Laundrie, which was made public in June of 2022? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll go through the background of this case. I'll summarize the note, then offer my analysis. 22-year-old Gabby Petito and 23-year-old Brian Laundrie were an engaged couple who lived in Northport, Florida, with Brian's parents. On July 2, 2021, after visiting Gabby's family in New York, the couple departed on a trip across the country in a 2012 Ford Transit Connect minivan. They traveled to various locations like national parks and were attempting to establish a social media presence, like they were documenting their adventure by posting material online. On August 12, in Moab, Utah, the police responded to a domestic violence incident involving the couple, but neither of them was arrested. Brian returned to Florida alone, but then met up with Gabby in Utah. The couple traveled to Grande National Park in Wyoming on August 24. At some point between August 27 and August 29, Gabby was strangled and left in the national park. Brian returned to Northport, Florida on September 1. He drove the minivan and was alone. On September 11, Gabby was reported missing. 2 days later, Brian disappeared. Gabby's body was found on September 19. The police started looking for Brian Laundrie. His body was found in a reserve in Florida on October 20, 2021. He had used a pistol to bring an end to his life. A notebook was recovered from the scene containing a handwritten message from Brian Laundrie. It was released to the public in late June 2022. In some ways, the case of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie is straightforward. Brian is clearly responsible for Gabby's death, but why he did it is not necessarily clear. In my opinion, Brian killed Gabby in the heat of the moment, probably in the course of an argument about their romantic relationship, but there is no way to know what happened for certain. The release of this handwritten note may bring some clarity to the topic. I will talk about the notebook itself, then move to my summary of the note and analysis. Starting with the notebook. The notebook contains a handwritten note that is about 828 words in length. Some of the words are fairly difficult to make out. They appear to be written in blue ink and may have been exposed to water. The note consumes 8 pages of the notebook. On the first page of the note, Brian did not write in the lines very well, but for the remaining 7 pages he did. Perhaps he started out emotional and calmed down throughout the course of writing the note. There are some areas where Brian scratched out certain words. He appears to have used a lot of ink to do this, suggesting some degree of thoughtfulness, like he had something specific he wanted to say and did not want to deviate from his message. The note is addressed to Gabby, but much of the narrative appears to be directed to other people, including the general public. Now moving to a summary of the note. Much of this is paraphrased, and I rearranged the order of some of the items to make them chronological. As I mentioned, the note is addressed to Gabby. Brian starts by saying he wishes Gabby was at his side, talking to him. They could explore every memory they've made and get even more excited about the future. Brian indicates that he can't live without Gabby. He has lost every day they would have spent together. He will always love her. He can't bear looking at their photographs and recalling the great times they've had. At this point, there's a pivot in the narrative. Now Brian appears to be talking to an audience other than Gabby. He indicated that if people read her journal, they would not want to live a day without her. Brian is sorry to everyone, including Gabby's family. He considered them to be his family as well. He implored the reader not to make this harder for Gabby's family or for his family. Gabby's death was an unexpected tragedy. At this point, Brian explains what happened in the moments leading up to Gabby's death. This, of course, is his story and not necessarily true. The couple was in the area of Spread Creek in Grande National Park. They were in a hurry trying to get back to their vehicle before it became too dark. They attempted to cross the creek. At this point, Brian heard a splash and a scream. He could not see well in the dark. He had trouble locating Gabby. He shouted her name, but eventually found her. She was breathing heavily, freezing cold, and gasping his name. Brian noted that they were accustomed to the heat of the national parks in Utah, but where they were now in Wyoming was freezing cold. He pulled Gabby from the water. She was soaking wet and freezing. She did not indicate how she was injured, but Brian noticed that there was a bump on Gabby's forehead that increased in size later. He did not know the full extent of her injuries. He carried her as far as he could down the stream toward their vehicle. She was shaking violently and making sounds of pain. She begged him to end her pain. Brian's knees buckled. He realized he couldn't safely carry her, so he started a fire and spooned her in an effort to keep her warm. He realized that he should have started the fire earlier, but he thought that trying to get to the vehicle was a better idea. He didn't know how far they were from the vehicle, but as it turns out, it was just on the other side of the creek. Gabby fell asleep, but Brian woke her up because he believed she had a concussion. She was angry at him every time he woke her up. She would not grant Brian permission to cross the creek because she was worried that the fire would go out when she was sleeping. Brian indicated that he brought an end to Gabby's life. He was trying to be merciful and fulfill her wishes. He was panicked and shocked. He finally realized that he had made several mistakes. He knew that he could not go on without Gabby. Brian rushed home to spend his remaining time with his family. He thought about allowing Gabby's stepfather or brother to kill him, but he did not want them to be incarcerated. Brian made it clear that the end of his life would occur because he lost his future with Gabby, not because he was afraid of prison. Brian apologized to Gabby. He said that he selected the area where his body was found so that the animals would tear him apart. He hoped it would bring happiness to Gabby's family. Brian concludes the note by asking the reader to pick up all of his belongings. He noted that Gabby was opposed to litter. Now moving to my analysis. The final note of Brian Laundrie confirmed what a lot of people thought, specifically that Brian Laundrie murdered Gabby Petito. But the note also contained unexpected elements, like this whole story of Gabby falling in the water and suffering from hypothermia. Here are my thoughts on a few items that stood out to me in this note. Item number 1. Brian made a number of references about himself. He used the pronoun I quite a few times when the word we would have been expected. It was all about how terrible this was for Brian. There were no true feelings of empathy for Gabby Petito. She died a horrible death, yet Brian was worried about himself. He wanted everybody to feel sorry for him. In his mind, he was the real victim, but he realized no one would ever believe him. Item number 2. Brian went out of his way to convince the reader that he and Gabby were destined for a lifetime of happiness together. Statistically, if there was no murder, it's unlikely that Gabby would have stayed with Brian for her entire life. But Brian wanted the reader to believe this. They were special. It was a magical romance. No one else could understand their amazing love. Brian went out of his way to convince the reader that Gabby was in love with him. It wasn't like she just rejected him or anything. I find this interesting because often these types of murders occur when a man is rejected by a woman. I think Brian was trying to hide this rejection, to go back in time and imagine when the relationship was good. He wanted to forever be in that moment where Gabby loved him. Another possibility, of course, is that Brian simply became angry and killed Gabby. There was no rejection functioning as a precipitating factor. In this case, obviously Gabby would have been fairly displeased with Brian as he was killing her. So here again we see Brian trying to rewrite what happened. He wants everybody to believe that Gabby loved him, regardless of his homicidal behavior. Item number 3. Brian tells a story of a hero's journey. He pulled Gabby out of the water, carried her until his legs failed, honored her last wishes by staying with her. Even his homicidal behavior was at her request. Brian's story is very difficult to believe for a number of reasons. Looking at temperature data from late August of 2021 in Grand Teton National Park, the highs would have been around 80 degrees and the lows around 40 degrees. If somebody fell in a creek that was at the low temperature, they would be pretty cold, but the temperature just after sunset was closer to 60 or 70 degrees. This is a bit warm for freezing to death. There are other questions as well. For example, why didn't Brian give Gabby his dry clothing? Why wasn't the fire effective for warming her up? Why didn't Brian simply go get help regardless of what Gabby was saying? And why didn't Brian know how far away the minivan was? Brian alluded to other possible injuries, like some damage to Gabby's head, which could mean that the freezing component wasn't that important. But murdering someone is not a typical response if a person is injured. When a person is with a companion who gets injured, it's not like they think to themselves, well, I could call 911, run to find help, or commit murder. Preventing death would be the primary objective. Causing death would be very far down on the list on how to achieve that objective. One could argue it's not even on the list at all. Furthermore, why did Brian try to hide the murder, like when he impersonated Gabby with text messages? Why did he run away after she was reported missing? It seems clear that Brian murdered Gabby and was trying to get away with it. He was afraid of prison, even though he tried to convince people otherwise in his note. There was never a hero's journey. There was only a coward's journey. Item number 4. I find it interesting that when Brian wrote this note, he knew that he wouldn't be around to face the consequences, yet he refused to accept responsibility in any meaningful way. He actually tried to place the blame for the homicide back on Gabby by saying that she asked him to do it, and she would not let him leave out of fear of the fire going out. Brian's level of narcissism was probably fairly high. Even when he would no longer have to face anybody, he could not own his own behavior. He had to protect his ego and his pride above anything else. He had an opportunity to bring a measure of peace to Gabby's family and friends. He could have said that he committed the murder and there was no excuse, but he chose to make nothing but excuses. In his final moments, Brian chose to continue his deceptive behavior. If anybody had compassion for Brian, he gave his best effort to eliminate that. Now moving to my final thoughts. Some people have wondered if Brian Laundrie was a master manipulator, but we see from his note that he was a clumsy and incompetent manipulator. He made these very obvious attempts to deceive the reader. Brian mixed in overly sentimental statements in with his attempts at deception, so perhaps later in life he would have been better at manipulation, like he was developing his skills when he committed the murder. He was on the road to being a more effective manipulator. Many people experienced in the area of romance would have known that Brian was bad news, but Gabby Petito was simply not old enough and not experienced enough to comprehend his clumsy and obvious attempts at manipulation. She was not able to appreciate the warning signs and may have been affected by her own affection for him. Like she didn't understand how some negatives, like violence, cannot be outweighed by any number of positives. Brian's last communication was an attempt to explain how he loved the person who he killed more than anything in the world. It offers a glimpse into the distorted thinking of a murderer and how they justify negative behavior with positive feelings. There is a tragic element in Gabby Petito's story, namely how she was killed by someone who said he loved her. Brian attempted to hijack this tragedy to cover his shame and to create this fantasy of a glorious relationship where he was actually the hero. But he only further revealed the depths of his self-centeredness, arrogance, and sense of entitlement. Those are my thoughts on the notebook left by Brian Laundrie. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.